Thank you, Caoirleach, and thank you, Senator Black, for outlining your position on this. As a female minister in the Department of Finance, I have a very acute interest in the gender distribution of policy made in the Department of Finance and on the impact, in particular, the inequitable outcomes for women in pensions and pension poverty in particular. And I'm very, very aware of that in everything that we do. And can I say to the Senator, I appreciate you've had an exchange with Minister McGrath in relation to this. I know that he has outlined specifically the work of the Interdepartmental Pensions Reform and Taxation Group, so I don't wish to repeat anything that my colleague has said and treat the House in that way. But I do want to outline some of the broader work that's happening in relation to identifying opportunities for better pension equity between men and women in particular. And this arises out of a number of different policy fall-offs where women have stepped out of the workforce for different reasons and have been at a strategic disadvantage over time. And that's a historical issue, and it cannot be allowed to be a current issue either. One of the things that I think is particularly important in relation to this, and I know it's coming to it from a slightly different angle to the way that you're suggesting in terms of a different approach to universality of pensions, a slightly different approach, but just if I can update the Senator. This is a key focus of one of the real drivers around capital markets union at an EU level, for example. I was present at your group meeting facilitated by Minister Donoghue, where there was a specific focus on how capital markets union and how access to wealth development, how access to small investment products, particularly on a retail basis, can really contribute to better pension equity. We see, for example, the very strong habits that are there in the Dutch financial system, where people get involved at developing investments at a much earlier stage and in a much more balanced way throughout society, not it being the preserve of any particular class or any particular profession, but a much more balanced approach across the economy, and how there is very little pension poverty as a consequence of some of that approach. One of the things that we really want to do at a European level is have a better retail investment strategy, and I think there's a particularly strong opportunity for women who, it appears, the more and more data I look at, it appears are much less likely to engage in investment, are much less likely to place a focus on their own pension provision than is often the case. And it is a really serious issue, and I suggest that there are a number of different ways of coming to this. One of them is, of course, a focus on gender budgeting in the department. Of course, I would say as a female minister that if you have enough female ministers making policy decisions over time, that you're less likely to need to place a gender lens on every decision, that those things should be much more natural, much more inherent in the policy development process. But I think it is also about recognising the gaps in the private market where women haven't been able to be, haven't felt themselves as comfortable or as included in some of those products that are available. I say all of this is in addition to the point that you make, of course, not necessarily as an alternative, but just that this is something that is a very, very strong focus for me as Minister of State in the department, where I think the voice of women has been underrepresented over time, and we see that in terms of taxation decisions, we see that in terms of decisions around coming back to the workforce, the marginal tax implications that may impact on a person's decision about whether to come in and out of the workforce, and this has fallen in a poorly distributed way against women time and time again. So I note the broad thrust of what you're trying to do with this recommendation, and I admire it. As you're aware, I'm not in a position to take recommendations of this kind at this stage of the bill, but I don't wish to leave the Senator with any sense that this isn't certainly at the front of my mind in terms of developing pension equity and developing gender equity throughout a number of different financial instruments. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Senator Black. This proposed recommendation requests a report on the potential revenue implications for the state if a 50% limit on deferred tax assets was imposed. As senators are aware, loss relief for corporation tax is a long-standing feature of the Irish corporate tax system and a standard feature of corporation tax systems in most OECD countries. And it recognises the fact that over a business cycle runs over several years, and it would be unfair to tax income earned in one year and not allow relief for losses incurred in another. A restriction on the amount of loss relief available to NAMA participating institutions was introduced in 2009, and it limited the relief that such losses could be used to shelter only 50% of taxable profits in any given year. The cap only affected the timing of the relief, it didn't affect the overall quantum, with restricted losses in any given year being carried forward to subsequent years for offset. The restriction was repealed in 2013. This was for reasons including to protect the value of the state's investments in banks, as by that stage the state had acquired substantial shareholdings in the banking sector, and a restriction on loss relief was considered to be working against the state's interests. It was a very different time. There have previously been proposals for the reintroduction of a limitation on loss relief for banks, and this has been discussed in detail in the Oireachtas on a number of occasions. A detailed technical note on considerations relevant to a restriction of loss relief both for banks and companies generally was prepared in 2018 by the Department of Finance for the Committee on Finance, Public Expenditure Reform and Taoiseach, and that remains available online as far as I am aware. Considerations set out in that paper include the difficulty of discriminating between industries or individual entities within the same industry in relation to the use of loss relief, as state aid implications would arise in respect of such a targeted measure. The reintroduction of a tax loss restriction of this nature could also have a number of negative impacts discussed in some detail in that published technical paper, and they include considerations relevant to the capitalisation of the banks and consequential impacts for consumers. It is also important to understand that the state has received value from the bank's deferred tax assets through its share sales to date and through the current valuation of the remaining shareholdings. A restriction on the use of losses could damage the state's credibility with investors and could negatively impact on future share sales. So for those reasons, a change to the tax treatment is not currently under consideration, and the detailed technical note has been prepared and published. I would, however, say, as the Senator has raised the bank levy, I think it is important to look at that over time and to look at what the levy has generated and what is expected. The levy generated 93 million in 2020 and 64 million in 2021, and that lower figure in 2021 was due to the exit of KBC and Ulster Bank. It is important now that to highlight about the revised bank levy to apply in 2024. Obviously, there was a public consultation on the future of that. The levy now will be charged at the rate of 0.112% of the value of deposits held by each liable bank on the 31st of December 2022, and the annual target yield from the levy is now €200 million. So that's very considerably increased and is a very considerable charge on the operation of banks. But for the reasons outlined in the 2018 paper and the broader reasons for the state's participation with the banks over time, we cannot accept the recommendation. Thank you, Hirlach. The proposed recommendation seeks the preparation of a report on the revenue that might be raised from and the distributional impact of a wealth tax of 2% on all households with assets over €20 million within 6 months of passing this bill into law. As senators from all sides of this House are aware, wealth can be taxed and is taxed in a variety of ways, many of which are already levied here in Ireland. Those include capital gains tax, capital acquisitions tax, which are taxes on wealth, in that they are paid by an individual or company on the disposal of an asset or the acquisition of an asset through gift or inheritance. There is, of course, also deposit interest retention tax, which is currently charged at 33% with limited exemptions on interest earned on deposit accounts. There is also local property tax, which is a tax based on the market value of residential properties. Another is stamp duty, which is charged on the transfer of shares, stocks and marketable securities of Irish registered companies, as well as on the purchase of property, both residential and non-residential. It follows that any revenue raised from a wealth tax, no matter what form it takes, may not therefore be additional to the existing forms of wealth taxation, as revenues from those taxes could be affected by the introduction of a wealth tax. That's not necessarily additive. In examining this topic, the Commission on Taxation and Welfare, which obviously reported in 2022, identified challenges that would impede the implementation of such a tax, and they concluded that a new tax on net wealth should not be introduced without first attempting to amend Ireland's existing taxes on capital and wealth. As an alternative to introducing a new tax on wealth, the Commission believed that the more productive route was to continually assess CGT and CAT. Those are, as I've already noted, existing taxes on wealth that have well-established but distinct tax bases and are well understood in their operation. In addition to wealth taxes, the government takes action against inequality through our tax and welfare system, and this is really, really important. We have a really strong redistributive role in the Irish tax and welfare system, and that is evident in the range of supports that are introduced to help mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the series of measures designed to limit the impact of the current cost of living pressures, notwithstanding the broader transfers that are made through our social protection system. Ireland has one of the most progressive systems of taxes and social transfers of any EU or OECD country, and that contributes to the redistribution of income and to the reduction of income inequality, even at a time of rising incomes. And that is a really important underlying economic condition. By way of example, in 2024, it's projected that the top 1% of taxpayer units, who are those with annual incomes of in excess of €290,000, will pay just over 24% of the total income tax and USC. That is a very large proportion of the total income tax and USC from such a small cohort of taxpayers. In comparison, 80% of taxpayer units, which is the cohort of income earners with annual incomes of less than €69,500 and account for about 2.74 million taxpayer units, will pay only 21% of income tax and USC. To further demonstrate the high amount of tax being paid by high earners under the current income tax and USC system in 2024, it is expected that there will be approximately 3.425 million taxpayer units, including married couples, under joint assessment, and that total yield from income tax and USC is projected to be €34.3 billion. Of that yield, approximately €7.372 billion will be paid in total by approximately 2.7 million taxpayer units with incomes of under €69,500 per annum, as I've said, and the remaining yield, over €26.9 billion, will be paid by less than 682,300 taxpayer units earning over €69,500. So I assure senators that not only do we have a very strong redistributive system, not only do we have a very strongly progressive tax system, but all taxes and potential taxation options are kept under constant consideration. The Commission of Taxation was indeed an analytic report on taxation in this state, and it remains a priority of this government and indeed of mine to make sure that Ireland maintains a reasonably progressive taxation system as we have developed over time. So I don't see the additional benefit that may be gained from a report of this nature at this time. I cannot therefore accept the recommendation. Thank you, Senator. The proposed recommendation attempts to create a link between the Irish corporate tax system on the one hand and human rights and welfare, including child welfare in the global south, on the other. And they really are distinct policy considerations. And I think what I can do is address the reform, the extensive work in recent years the Department of Finance has undertaken to update the Irish corporate tax system, much of which is actually included in this bill in terms of the OECD base erosion and profit shifting project, which we have been supporters from since its inception. Most of those actions have relevance for the interaction of Ireland's tax system with other jurisdictions, including developing countries. They are, of course, considered in detail in the update to Ireland's corporate tax roadmap published in 2021. I would say Ireland has been a committed participant in the OECD BEPS project since its inception. It was one of the first countries to sign and ratify the then BEPS multilateral instrument. It was a groundbreaking international agreement that significantly reduces the potential for tax treaties to be used for tax avoidance purposes. Our commitment to transparency and exchange of information has received international commendation. Indeed, we're only one of a small handful of jurisdictions worldwide to be twice recognised as fully compliant with all international best practice by the OECD-led Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes. We are a leader in tax transparency at both OECD and EU and have negotiated, agreed and implemented significant new rules on tax transparency to ensure tax authorities have access to tax rulings, to anti-money laundering information, to country-by-country reports, mandatory disclosure of tax planning agreements by tax advisors and digital platforms. We've signed up to the OECD two-pillar solution to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalisation of the economy in October 2021. We're already delivering on that commitment. Pillar 2 of the agreement, which we're implementing in the Finance Bill, provides for a 15% global minimum effective tax rate on a jurisdictional basis for large multinational enterprises with an annual turnover of €750 million. The purpose of that pillar is to put a floor under international competition and to level the playing field for all countries, including in particular developing countries, in competing to attract foreign investment. Turning now to actions specifically relevant to developing countries, and I think this is important. Ireland was one of the first countries to commission an independent spillover analysis of the impact of our tax system on developing countries. That research project was commissioned by the Department of Finance. The methodology was designed and carried out by the independent and highly respected International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation. That independent research project included an analysis of trade and capital flows between Ireland and developing countries, an analysis of Ireland's tax treaty networks with developing countries, and a review of relevant provisions of domestic tax legislation. And that analysis, published in 2015, concluded that there were no negative spillovers from the Irish tax regime on the economies of developing countries. Two older double tax agreements were renegotiated on more favourable terms for our partner jurisdictions in light of that report. I would also note that following government approval, Ireland's first double tax treaty policy statement was published in 2021, and that policy statement outlines a series of economic drivers for potential new partners, including the creation of a priority list. But more importantly, there is a specific policy for the least developed countries in the world, and that commits to not approaching any least development country for a treaty, and where approached by such a country, a commitment to be cognizant of the specific needs of such countries and to ensure that any treaty would deliver economic benefits for the treaty partner before agreeing to such a treaty. I would also like to just highlight some of the outputs of what we're able to do because of our fiscal position at the moment, which I think demonstrates our continued commitment into international aid and to international support, particularly for the Global South. And just in the last 2 weeks, Ireland's commitment is pledged to reach by next year €225 million in climate finance directly for projects that are needed around the world, but particularly recognising small island nations, smaller economies, where Ireland has contributed 25 million to the COP28 Loss and Damage Fund that was announced. And at the time that was announced, and I'm just saying that in case we've been overtaken by events, but Ireland was the second largest contributor per capita globally after the UAE, and it's a hugely significant commitment. And the same week we gave €12 million to the Centre for Emergency Response funding from the UN, which put us in the top 10 in absolute terms as contributors, not just even on a per capita basis. And of course, we fund the UN Development Programme with its commitment to developing sustainable finance centres around the globe and its commitment to gender in that in particular. So we have a hugely outward-looking aid policy in every department that we have: Department of Finance, Department of Energy, Department of Foreign Affairs, and we are certainly committed to that in terms of tax as well, and I think the evidence is very clearly there in relation to that. Thank you very much. Tackling vacancy is an urgent priority for this government, and I think an urgent priority for every member of these houses. And it's appropriate that every available lever is deployed to incentivise the use of existing housing stock across the country. So that includes measures to deter vacancy, but alongside supportive measures which you've mentioned, such as grants. So for that reason, as part of that, the Minister for Finance announced in the budget that the rate of vacant home tax would increase to 5 times the property's existing base local property tax rate. The increase would apply to the chargeable period that commenced on the 1st of November 2023 and all future chargeable periods. For the chargeable period just ended on 31st of October 2023, the rate of vacant home tax remains at 3 times the amount of local property tax in respect of that property. We're discussing here the option of a recommendation of a report on various aspects of the tax, such as increasing the rate and inclusion of derelict properties within its scope. As the vacant homes tax is still a relatively new measure, it is important to see how it operates after coming into effect, including the most recent change in the rate of tax, and to make an assessment as to how it is working. But I mean, it is working only if it is bringing properties back in. So ideally, fewer and fewer properties would be paying the tax, and the tax take would then go down, and that would be a measure of success. Unlike most taxes. So we will monitor that as part of the ordinary policy monitoring process conducted by Department of Finance officials and Revenue in respect of all new tax measures. We will monitor the tax, and if appropriate, we will review the matters outlined. But I think in terms of developing the tax, it is important to ensure that it's easy to understand, it's efficient to administer. We do want the tax to work and have the effect. That's why it was set at a multiple of the property's base local property tax, as that system is already well understood. By increasing the rate of the tax in this finance bill, the vacant home tax will then, we hope, have the effect of penalising any property owners whose properties remain vacant in the first and current chargeable period. I think it also sets an important signal that it really isn't socially acceptable to retain vacant properties really any further, and that they must be brought into use. The tax then plays an important role in addressing vacancy, but we have to make sure that we're providing the incentives as well, with the objective of encouraging the use of available housing. It is important to recognise, as Senator Cummins has done regarding derelict properties, that there are grants available of up to €70,000 to make it into a habitable home, and that it's essential that those grants are availed of and used. As Senator Dolan points out, it can be difficult to absorb the upfront cost of doing up a house, and that there is a timing question which I think is as yet unresolved on the application of these grants. I do, as I have discussed in this House before, it is something that I have discussed with the credit union with the credit union movement. Some credit unions are offering bridging finance to be able to meet the needs at an earlier stage, to be able to recognise that this is a loan that will certainly be repaid by the state on its part of it. And there is a flexibility that is to be achieved there as more and more credit unions take up that option. But it is a credit union by credit union decision, and it's not something that I can mandate. But it is interesting to see how effective it can be when a single individual manager takes an idea such as that. We see similar proactivity being rewarded in your own county in Waterford. Senator Cummins, in respect of the repair and lease scheme, which has gone exceptionally well. We see something similar in Louth historically, where they had really exceptionally good outcomes in terms of the CPO process. And again, initiatives such as these, driven by single individuals or a group of individuals, can be incredibly effective, and it does raise questions as to why vacancy persists in other local authority areas when some have had extremely good effect through a targeted use of the measures available to them. Specifically, though, on the tax, regarding derelict properties, the tax seeks to target properties which are habitable and ready to be occupied quickly. So vacant homes tax applies to properties which are residential properties for the purpose of local property tax, which is property suitable for a dwelling. So in that way, the tax targets properties which could be put to use with greater immediate effect. The issue of dereliction is very related. Senators will be aware that the Derelict Sites Act falls under the responsibility of our colleagues in the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage. I understand that his department continues to liaise with local authorities on the implementation of the Derelict Sites Act 1990 with a view to improving its effectiveness, and I understood that a report was due to be forthcoming very soon on that. So at this point, the vacant homes tax is part of a broader suite of measures. It isn't the Minister for Housing has launched his Vacant Home Action Plan in January of this year. That document outlines the progress made in addressing vacancy, along with actions being pursued to return as many vacant and derelict properties back into use as quickly as possible. I think it is important to point out that initiatives such as the Vacant Property Refurbishment Grant, Ready to Build scheme under the Creecunhead Towns Fund, the incentives that are provided are important. So just to say that the Vacant Property Refurbishment Grant has been successful, with 5,500 applications received to date, of which 2,800 have been approved. So there is some success there to date, but there's obviously a long way to go with that. The government has recently agreed to raise the target to 4,000 homes refurbished by 2025, and again would underline the opportunity to use compulsory purchase orders as well. If I could just take the opportunity to clarify some figures that I quoted to Senator Black earlier in respect of the bank levy. I was given a note which gave you three figures. I actually just like to correct that. The yield reported for the bank levy was 2020 150 million, 2021 150 million, and 2022 87 million, but I will write to the Senator directly on that point with a full outline, so my apologies for the error in my note.
Is the amendment being pressed, a recommendation?
Senators will be aware that the government is committed to tackling climate change and decarbonising the economy by 2050. We are very much aware of the challenges that subsidies pose to our collective effort to disincentivise fossil fuels. And indeed, we are stuck in a very difficult transition period as we both try to help people meet their energy bills and transition the economy to a renewably based energy sources. The programme for government, the Climate Action Plan, as well as the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, form broad policy and legislative frameworks for moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy and alternative fuels and technology. Carbon tax is an especially important part of that, and those committed to climate change would of course support that. Climate change mitigation would of course support that. But it is of course recognised that it is a transition for households and for businesses in this country, and that we have yet to build many of the renewable opportunities that are there in front of us. In my own constituency, there is a renewable project which could cheaply and very, very cleanly power up to 700,000 homes in Dublin, and it is these sorts of projects that require support and activation. Ireland's excise duty, more specifically on the treatment of fuel used for air navigation, is governed by the European Union law as set out in Directive 2003/96 EC on the taxation of energy products and electricity, commonly known as the Energy Tax Directive. The provisions of the current Energy Tax Directive relating to aviation fuels are transposed into national law in the Finance Act 1999 as amended, which provide for the application of excise duty in the form of mineral oil tax to liquid fuels used for motor and heating purposes. Heavy oil is the most commonly used fuel type in commercial air navigation, and the ETD currently obliges all member states to exempt heavy oil for intra-community and international air transport purposes. A member state may waive this exemption for intra-community flights, but only where it has entered into a bilateral agreement with another member state to tax fuel, but there are no such agreements in place across the EU at present. In addition, senators would be aware that in July 2021, as part of the Fit for 55 package, the EU Commission published a proposal to revise the Energy Tax Directive, and that taxation of intra-community flights forms part of the proposal to date. This has proved really one of the more contentious aspects of the file because of the wish of certain member states to maintain the exemption on taxation of excise fuel. So, in conclusion, given that there are no bilaterals already in place and the Energy Tax Directive is currently subject to renegotiation with the taxation of aviation fuel on the agenda, the Minister for Finance does not see any potential for bilateral agreements to tax fuel for intra-community flights at the present moment. Instead, the Minister believes that a collaborative EU-wide approach is the most effective way of addressing this issue, and accordingly Ireland will continue to engage with the Commission and Member States to reach a well-balanced and effective compromise on the proposal. I would say separately that as Minister with responsibility for financial services, that the aircraft leasing industry in this jurisdiction, which leases over half of the world's airplanes, has a very, very strong interest in developing the renewable opportunity here and developing sustainable aviation fuel from this jurisdiction, and that there's an important parallel opportunity for this state in the development of that economy also. But I cannot accept the recommendation for the EU reasons.
Any further comments?